Bitcoin mining is a global industry, and over the years we've seen miners constantly move around the world to wherever the conditions are the best. Sometimes that's because of cheap energy, sometimes because of regulation, and sometimes because of government policy. That's exactly what led us to create a new report called the Bitcoin Mining Ease to Mine Index. The report is based on a survey of around 50 industry participants who helped evaluate how easy it is to mine Bitcoin in different parts of the world. Using their input, we scored 18 countries across a range of factors including regulation, fiscal policy, energy markets, permitting, and operational conditions. In this episode, I speak with the author of the report, Valentin Rousseau, who walks us through the framework behind the index and the key findings from the research. If you'd like to read the full report yourself, you can find the link in the show notes. Let's get into it. Hello, Valentin, and welcome to the HashLabs podcast.
Hi, Aaron. I'm glad to be with you today.
So, can you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the research and lead analyst at HashLabs. And over the past 2 months, I've been dedicated to conduct a research report on the regulatory and operating condition of nearly 18 jurisdictions around the world. And we have built an index called the Ease to Mine Index. So the Ease to Mine Index for Bitcoin mining, giving a score on each jurisdictions. And by the past, I've been a co-author of last Bitcoin mining research report published by Cambridge. And now this is my own piece for HashLabs.
Yeah, so in this podcast, we will go through the report. I will ask Valentin some questions that are, I think, relevant for the listeners. And I can also say the background for why we decided to make this report. So World Bank have created this Ease of Doing Business Index, and it's widely used by businesses to analyze which countries they can do business in. We thought that Bitcoin mining should have something similar. So Ease to Mine Index is a little bit building on that World Bank framework of Ease of Doing Business Index, but just specifically for mining. And also, as Valentin can go more into detail about, the report is mostly focused on the regulation because that has been not enough emphasized in Bitcoin mining analysis on a country level so far. It's mostly focused on power prices and not so much on the regulation, which is arguably even more important. So Valentin, do you have anything to add here about the report before we start to dive into it?
It's based on a survey for 5 sections. There is an additional section which is climate operating condition that mainly deal with the operating environment for hardware miners and how sustainable or comfortable you can mine in a given jurisdiction that it's beyond the survey scope. But the 5 other sections, which are legal, fiscal, permit and licensing framework, as well as grids and energy access, and eventually tariff and custom procedures, are all based on survey answers. And we collected data from 48 respondents. So that's why we can state that it's quite robust. It was a non-linear weighting that have been attributed to those 5 sections. So it's about legal 17.5%, same as permitting and licensing. The fiscal framework was 20%, the energy and grid access 25%, and eventually the climate and operating condition 5%. And I didn't mention the tariff and custom procedures, which has weights of 15%.
What would you say is the main key takeaway from this report?
It's about 85 to 90% of the country score. Even if we do include some operating conditions or parameters, you should break it down, deep dive into it, and look at each individual section. For instance, if I take Chile, so Chile scores 0.44. You should have in mind that 0 is the worst operating environment and 1 is the best operating environment. If you just look at the extreme of the reports, the best place to mine is considered to be Oman with 0.75, and the worst is Australia with 0.28. But we will get back into them just later. Just an important idea, an important thing to have in mind when reading the report is that it's breakdown. Because when you look at Chile, it looks like it's just slightly unfavorable to mine there. But actually, the energy and grid conditions score about 0.18. To explain why, you have extremely high power cost relative to the industry median, which was assessed as $45 per megawatt hour. So I'm talking about direct electricity cost. In Chile, it's above 60. And also you have very important barriers to enter the market. So Australia, it's similar to Chile in terms of energy structure and energy market. It's quite expensive to mine there. It's between $50 to $60 per megawatt hour, if not more. Also operating conditions in South Australia and West Australia, which are the main mining hubs, are quite unfavorable due to high and very hot temperatures, especially during summers. And also the permit and the licensing framework is quite stringent. Why? Because you have a very high level of environmental restrictions, which can impact your zoning, the zoning regulation on data center operation. But it's mainly about land availability for data center constructions. And also you have a very, very and deeply negative sentiment about the Australia direction trend about the future regarding mining and the overall data center environment, despite the importance of AI and the shift that some regions in the world have done, such as Europe, but not in Australia yet. And the two others, which are Sweden and Chile. So I already spoke about Chile, even if there is a favorable fiscal framework with incentives in Chile, specifically for data centers. Actually, it's one of the main hub for data centers in Latin America, Chile. But there is one key important information about Chile is that you have a large bureaucracy burden that remains, with very important lead times for construction permits and for grid connection, as I've said already. And this is impacting the mining infrastructure that you would develop there. And about Sweden, Sweden is widely known. The fiscal framework is very detrimental to any miners. Why? Because you have recently this retroactive application on the VAT. VAT is no non-refundable in Sweden, but in addition to that, they are reclaiming back to miners that were exempt, and I didn't pay the VAT on importing our hardware, and it's very hard to avoid it, even if you have mitigation mechanism. And also the legal framework is quite unfavorable, and you have also heavy electricity tax. You can fact check on the report, but it's about $36 per megawatt hour of electricity tax in your power consumption in Sweden.
Yeah, it's so Swedish miners were essentially hit by two very big problems almost at the same time a couple of years ago. That was the electricity tax was increased, and this VAT retroactive that they had to pay. Like some of them had to pay tens of millions of dollars in retroactive taxes. So let's look on the fiscal side. So who are the winners on the fiscal side, and who are the loser?
Yeah. The winners unavoidably are Oman, UAE, also Texas, which is the proxy for United States, and Chile, as I already mentioned, and Iceland. So why Oman and UAE, which are leading by far? Because there are a lot of special economic zones that exempt not only for corporate income taxes, but also for VAT and any tariffs. And given the weight it can have on importing hardware and on the price of hardware, and also on your break-even and the time you recover your investment, having this exemption remain critical, and if not, it's like a windfall. It's an Eldorado really for miners, because you not only have fiscal incentives through apartments, but also you have some subsidies in some case, because namely in UAE, the power is largely subsidized, even though in agricultural lands, which by the past people could have access to $12 per megawatt hour. No, it's forbidden because too much people were connected to this agriculture, and it was actually prohibited to consume such amount of energy. But still, in UAE, the power remains subsidized to attract power projects which are large scale and can sometimes be an incentive for some behind the meter projects, such as solar plants.
Yeah, and for everyone's information, when we discussed earlier here that miners often tend to focus too much on power prices and neglecting a lot of other factors that are critical, probably the most important and most neglected factor is import tariffs and VAT on imports. This is really crucial. There are only a few countries in the world where you really can import the machines very easily without paying substantial fees. And if you have ASICs worth millions of dollars, like just even 5% import taxes can be enormous, have an enormous impact on your profitability. So this is also, as you mentioned, Oman, you can get exemptions and they don't have necessarily import taxes, right?
Yeah, completely. And I will also close on other jurisdictions that I didn't mention. Regarding Democratic Republic of Congo, the customs and tariffs are quite elevated. So that's why you see operators that have their proprietary supply chains and that import their mining hardware or their infrastructure by their own means. Why? Because it's about 180% tariffs on ASICs if you import it through, I would say, not legal ways, but through the standard custom procedures. So it's quite also detrimental from this end. And also, very importantly, regarding energy and grid condition losers, I would say, Democratic Republic of Congo and Kenya suffer from an aged infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, and also undeveloped because many people don't have access to electricity there, and sometimes you have quite large surplus at small hydropower plants, namely in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why? Because just you don't have the transmission lines, electrical infrastructure there, and that's why you tend to have a lot of mini grids or off-grid projects that can tape about lower than $35 per megawatt hour. Now, if I go back to the fiscal conditions of the other countries such as Iceland or even Texas, what is also a key advantage that is not available in all the countries is the ability to shift the profit center to another country. Yeah, that's a main advantage, and also in Iceland, but also in the US, you have a neutral level of constraint to avoid or mitigate the taxes, which is actually quite important when looking at this fiscal framework.
Yeah, in mining, it's kind of a standard way to operate in many countries with very high taxes is to have a hosting company in a very low tax country, or the mining company in a very low tax country that owns the machines and get the actual Bitcoin from these machines, and thereby you can shift the tax out of that country. And the country you operate in, where the machines are physically located, it's only a hosting facility. So it will have lower profits. And this is a standard way in data center industry to shift profits abroad. And this is, as Valentin said, is not possible in all countries. One thing that was kind of fascinating, let's move to permit and licensing, is that many of the countries that score quite bad on, for example, energy and grid access, like some of the African countries, for example, they score very well on permit and licensing because they don't have a well-developed framework of permit and licensing. Like they haven't, since they're developing countries, they haven't been able yet to develop all this red tape, which makes them a bit easier to operate in than some of the more developed countries. So this is quite quite interesting benefit of operating in some developing countries, or what do you think?
No, that's totally the reason why in African countries, but also in others, but mainly in African countries, the lack of zoning regulation, the lack of important lead times on permits, because you don't need these permits actually, will actually just make your deployment of infrastructure halves. It will considerably accelerate the pace at which you can just deploy your rigs and set up a mining site. Still, it also means that it can become a volatile framework in the future. But from most of those jurisdictions, we don't expect a framework to be settled at least in the medium term. So I'm talking about 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, so essentially the main benefit of operating in the developing countries, like for example, Democratic Republic of Congo, is the enormous lack of permit and licensing requirements. So we see that the DRC have a very high score here. Almost no permits and licenses required. While, for example, Australia, it seems like a very big amount of red tape in Australia, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What everyone should have in mind in the score about permits and licensing is about first, do you need an import license to operate? Do you need an operational license to operate? Because it's not the same. The import license is more about the license you will require to import hardware, and traditionally we see that this import license is mainly required in Latin America countries, but not every Latin America countries. And also, if we continue to deep dive into this section, it's about, so as I've said, zoning regulation for land availability, and also emission level, heat and compliance level, and noise, obviously, on data center operation. And also you have the construction permits lead time. In Australia, I do remember that it's more than 6 months, but obviously the audience can fact check by looking at the results in the reports. But if we move to, for instance, a more favorable jurisdiction such as Brazil, you don't need an operating license to operate there. Still, there is a mandatory registration to the tax authorities and sometimes to the grid operator, such as is the case in Paraguay. The construction permits are typically secured quite rapidly. So in Brazil, it's between 3 to 6 months, which is the standard in this report. And the environmental impact assessment and zoning regulation are very modest, and even the zoning restrictions on just land availability are quite low. So that's really interesting, because that's not the case of all the jurisdictions, particularly, the environment in Texas, where zoning regulation have been an issue, even though some miners have tried to solve it with specific type of infrastructure, such as immersion or hydro, which are much less louder.
So one other thing that I noticed in the report is that it seems like Latin American countries in general have main barrier there is the import, right? And the taxes and volatile environment of importation. So what do you think about that?
To everyone, should just remind that in all Latin America countries, almost all, you have the ability to deploy efficient mitigation mechanism. So the mitigation mechanism will vary by country, but it's always about having the right custom brokers. So I do remember it's not Latin America, but it's the same case in Paraguay and in Ethiopia. If you are working with a proficient, with an experienced custom broker, a clearing agent, it will just save your life because it won't apply the same rates, and it will also be able and capable of evaluating, assessing the right value of your ASICs, your hardware, and not price it at the price it was in 2021 or 2020, where there was a bubble on ASICs. So that's actually very critical to have the right custom brokers. And also, you will see in other countries such as the UAE that it's very important to have I would say, a clearing department, even if it's a very favorable jurisdictions for tariff. But this is about the second preoccupation, consideration that people should have in mind. It's not only about tariffs, it's also about delay, because, for instance, and that's typically the case in Brazil. In Brazil, you have a lot of layers of, I won't say tariffs, but VAT, so state taxes, municipal taxes, and also federal taxes. But you can avoid it through several mechanisms, such as applying for the right qualification, and also by just having the right agent, and I would say the good advisory firm on your end. So in Brazil, you can go from just weeks to months in which you are waiting for your ASICs to come to your site, just by having the good relationships. So that's really critical to have this in mind.
Yeah. So let's move to the map that you created.
Sure.
So for those who watch this episode, you can see the map. For listeners, you can imagine the map in your mind, and it's pretty cool. You can see that some countries are red, some are green, the best scores overall. Of course, it would be really cool to analyze all the countries in the world and have like the whole map colored, but unfortunately, that's will taking several years to accomplish. But that's eventually the goal here. One thing I noticed is that Americas in general is scoring very well. Like whole Americas region is quite green on this map, while the rest is not so green.
Yeah. I would say that first, when you are looking at Canada, it's the mean score of Alberta and Quebec. And regarding the US, the Texas is the proxy for the score. About America, why America is performing better if we exclude Chile, it's because in those jurisdictions you don't have expecting the US, but you don't have the tariff burden because you have efficient mitigation mechanism there. And if we especially focus on Latin America, the issue that's not an issue no more, but it was the issue of the delay. The challenge has been overcome since, again, you have experienced people in this market that have been able to use efficient mitigation mechanism, and you have a bit of a regulatory change, specifically in Argentina with tariff exemption. That's also the case in Brazil. You have a tariff exemption on ASICs, and so that might be actually a short-term regulatory environment specifically for this taxation, tariffs, and custom procedures. So that's important to have in mind that Latin America remain volatile, and North America are will offer quite stable conditions, even if the arrival of AI and HPC are shifting the market, and specifically the grid interconnection market in air courts. Those regions offer fiscal and clear legal environment, and even in Canada, when you have very hostile regions that have enacted moratorium bans on mining, there is still some, I would say, not gray zone, but gray to white zone, specifically in Quebec. You have in Quebec, it's really interesting. You have a 1 cent per megawatt tax on any new mining that's coming to the grid, but it's not targeting the sites that are not under the Hydro-Quebec grid operator, which is the grid operator that manages about 90% of Quebec grid. But still, some territories that have abundant hydropower are not concerned, and that's specifically the case of, I do remember, bit farm sites, which are in Sherbrooke, in Joliet, and even the site of previously owned or still owned maybe by Argo in Bécomo. So that's actually, it's very interesting to see that there are always details and specifics that can be leveraged to implement your sites and still have stable conditions in what seems to be an hostile environment at first view.
Yeah, and then we can look at, let's say, the Nordics, which is the main mining hub in Europe. And this region has been quite stable for like 8 or 9 years with mining for a long time. But in the last couple of years, Sweden and Finland have started some sort of, the tax authorities have started a bit harassing miners, I would say. So first of all, electricity taxes were introduced in both these countries for miners or for data centers in general, and miners are in that category, which significantly increased the cost of operating in these countries for electricity. And then on top of that, you got the VAT retroactively. So this has not happened in Norway, luckily, although we have an electricity tax for miners, but that is not so big. But at least Sweden, we've seen miners like hash rate, I would say, is shrinking in Sweden almost. It's not for sure not growing. So what exactly has happened in the north of Europe with mining?
The north of Europe, and we should exclude Iceland, because Iceland is actually a pretty good country to mine. You don't have such stringent conditions regarding the zoning side, specifically zoning rules, specifically because most of them are operating in very remote area, even if it's the core, I would say, principle of mining activity, but still they are pretty favorable with this industry, even though you have I would say, a governmental that's publicly advertised the willingness to shift from mining to AI HPC data center, which are supposedly providing more value to the country. And still, you can't access the national grid operator, but the other, not grid operator, but power company, but the other private power companies are still accessible, and you can have very affordable tariffs, power tariffs. In the meantime, you have the other Nordic countries that you mentioned, such as Finland, Sweden, and Norway. So the main issue with those countries is, as you said, the fiscal framework that evolved badly regarding the VAT retrospective application in Sweden and Norway. In Finland, the power costs are just a bit just above the median, so it's about 47.5 to almost $55 per megawatt hour, rather than in Norway, in Sweden, that is closer to that is less to $35 per megawatt hour. But as you said, the electricity tax in Sweden is very detrimental. And in Norway, you have no consideration about new zoning rules that should be enforced in data center activity, and that will be really detrimental for any other mining development there. But still, it has to be adopted by the government, but it's planned actually. So it's really interesting to see that the historically known politically stable regions, Nordic regions, are a bit volatile on mining. And it's really important to underline this information for people, is that when you contribute or when you have positive synergies to the grid or to the people, to the citizens, such as heat reuse by the integration to district heating, there is potential to hedge from these headwinds. Especially, do not remember, I think it's in Norway, but you can avoid the electricity tax, and that's the case in Kazakhstan. You can avoid the electricity tax if you grid, or if you, for example, you can hit homes. So that's really important to have this in mind, and that's the case in Finland.
And this was also something we saw even in Democratic Republic of Congo. Like the miners operate in that national park and actually use that revenue from the mining operation to employ like people to protect the park and take care of the park. They are exempted apparently from some taxes and getting some beneficial treatment from the government. So they in return kind of get protection from the national government. So this is working in all countries, like both developed countries and developing countries. If you provide some very big benefits to the society, you can use that to negotiate and get something in return as well. So let's move to eastward. Let's move to Russia. What is going on there? Because Russia has been the second biggest mining hub in the world for a long time and seen tremendous growth of hash rate. We published a report about mining in Russia about 3 months ago, but it's kind of stopped growing now, I would say. What is going on in Russia with terms of regulation and everything?
In terms of regulation, what we have witnessed is seasonal bans and some permanent bans on some regions. But in the meantime, we had advancements not on the mining framework, but at least on the digital asset framework. And actually, we are also seeing some potential developments regarding a much less opaque regulatory framework for mining. And specifically, people in Russia are expecting a law that is supposed to increase the transparency regarding the compliance mechanism for international transactions, and that will provide something strong and something much more robust to move from a gray to a white zone in terms of operating conditions. In the meantime, Russia have seen a rising power cost. It was a legacy power cost were about $45 per megawatt hour, and now it's more if you have new permits, it's about $55 to $65 per megawatt hour, so it's quite important. And in the meantime, you have access to off-grid sites that offer sub $35 per megawatt hour electricity cost. So it really depends where you are, but obviously, it remains difficult to install and to set up an off-grid installation, specifically for gas flaring, because also otherwise it's mostly about hydropower that is fueling the mining appetite in Russia. And I will add also regarding the regulatory framework that Russia has banned any foreign entities to mine in Russia. You must have a Russian that operate in your company, Russian people, and owned by Russian people at least, so that it remains legal to mine there. You have a very high level of constraints to avoid or mitigate taxes, so there is no electricity taxes, and obviously an inability to shift the profit center abroad. You are getting a license, and the construction permits here are quite variable because it can range from 3 to 12 months to be obtained, and it's moderately significant level of zoning rules to abide by. But in the meantime, the grid connection on average is taking 12 months, so it's quite long, and you still have a moderate level of barriers to entry for energy and grid connection. And at the moment, only 1/3 of the mining power on the mining compute there is registered officially, and you still have 2/3 of mining that is operating, I won't say illegally, but that is unregistered, and that could be actually, I won't say an issue, but that could lead to maybe more bans or greater political intervention involvements of the government regarding this gray zone that continues to operate. And overall, the custom frameworks is relatively favorable because you have no tariff. Even so, there is 22% VAT, but some are actually mitigating the impact by importing through East countries, mainly about Belarus. So the idea is to import machines from Belarus to optimize some import fees.
So essentially, Russia have several problems right now. One is the rising electricity tariffs. The other is that before the industry was not regulated, and it was very easy to operate in Russia, but then they regulated the industry. Many people thought that this would be good, but essentially just made it very difficult to operate there. And also, if we move to Kazakhstan, so Kazakhstan was the first one to implement a very stringent and detailed regulatory framework for Bitcoin mining specifically. And it seems a lot like Russia was learning a bit from that framework and implementing it in Russia as well. Just, of course, not completely the same, but a little bit. So Kazakhstan is very interesting right now because they were very against mining or first he supported it very much in like 2021. Then it came too much mining to Kazakhstan. Then they went against it, implemented very tough regulation. And now they easing this regulation gradually because they understand that they actually want mining in the country, at least some mining. So can you explain more in detail what is going on in Kazakhstan? Because we have had Danyar from the Kazakhstan Blockchain Association. He has been really helpful in the report. And yeah, so we did a very deep study on Kazakhstan. What is going on in Kazakhstan, Valentin?
In Kazakhstan, what you can find for the moment is quite neutral environment. And as you said, is in stark contrast with the past, in which we previously saw a ban and even a crackdown on miners because the government were engaged in erasing the industry from Kazakhstan. And now it's it's a bit funny because we see more favorable regulatory framework that is transitioning from the past, from this really hostile regulation. So following the crackdown, the industry sentiment has really improved among officials. And you can see it with the Bitcoin treasury reserves that have been proposed, and also mostly when you look at mining the 70-30 initiative. So you can break down regarding this initiative in the report, but the idea is miners will be able to connect at behind the meter of grid sites, and in the meantime help financing the transmission infrastructure of Kazakhstan. So that's pretty much the deal. Know why Kazakhstan is not scoring better regarding the condition, because even the electricity tax is really low. For off-grid sites is about $2 per megawatt hour. On-grid sites is $4 per megawatt hour. You have the ability to shift the profit center abroad, and upcoming laws are expected to actually support the industry development. You have even discussion about exempting the VAT on ASIC hardware and also on power cost. So that's actually very bullish, but it's still have to be implemented. It's just discussed for the moment, and it's not even in draft bills. But here, what is great in Kazakhstan is you have low level of, or neutral level, I would say, of zoning rules for either data center operation or land availability. The environmental impact assessment, water permits are not burdensome at all. You have no stringent rules. And the construction permits can be obtained quite rapidly in 2 months or 6 months for the, I would say, more significant and for the larger sites. But the main issue for Kazakhstan or Kazakh miners will be if you are on grid, to mine with a cost that is ranging from $55 to $65 per megawatt hour, which is quite high for the industry, especially if you are not the newest machines set up. Whether off-grid installation can offer power cost below $35 per megawatt hour, but it's not very developed yet. It's a very small industry, the off-grid industry in Kazakhstan. And in the meantime, the grid connection lead time can exceed 24 months. So that's why it's great to develop off-grid sites. And actually, that's the same case in Alberta. People tend to develop off-grids because the grid connection is much too long, just too long. But just the key distinction with Alberta is that you have such a level of restriction, and again, it's about environmental laws and zoning restrictions, that even connecting to off-grid to gas sites is pretty hard in Alberta. But let's go back to Kazakhstan, and if we close with the custom procedures and tariffs, the VAT is the only tariff that is applicable there, which is 16%. And as I've said, you have discussion regarding the potential to withdraw, to remove the tax for importation on ASICs and for miners, and the import procedures are quite neutral for ASICs, favorable for electrical infrastructure. So it's quite good to mine there. expect from the energy and regulation and grid access. And the climate operating condition can be a bit tough. Why? Because you have very important diurnal spread during the seasons. The weather it's with negative 29 degrees in the winter or 30 degrees above 30 degrees in the summer. You have to properly manage your infrastructure to deal with those constraints, but those constraints remain manageable with the current technology available on the market.
So, are there any other countries you would like to talk specifically about?
No, I think we have done a great coverage. I will just close with Ethiopia and also maybe some bullet shots on what our expectation we could see in the future about the worldwide diversification and mining footprint. So regarding Ethiopia, the government has set electricity tariffs, as I know, and you have talks for the moment that are dealing with and speaking about potential profit share between the government and the mining operator. So the idea would be that you have a baseline power cost, and if the power cost goes below this threshold, miner will actually not earn the better price, but it will be absorbed by the government. So that's kind of profit sharing that is currently conceived by the government, but it's completely unofficial. So that's the first important information. And also there is a potential to see VAT that will eventually apply on mining hardware, but it's not official yet. But if the VAT apply on mining hardware in Ethiopia, it will actually become a large burden, specifically if you have a retroactive application on past orders. So that's the main takeaway for Ethiopia, because this region has been largely known for very cheap electricity costs, but important delay and custom procedure and delay on importing ASICs and very, very large level of burden on the custom procedure sides, even if you have no very low tariffs there. So that's the first. And I will close this podcast with the idea that Paraguay and Brazil and as well Argentina will attract most of the exodus in my view from Texas and from the US side, at least regarding the new deployments, because I don't expect that legacy infrastructure will shut down, expected for operators shifting from AI HPC or from mining to AI HPC. Iceland, even if it's favorable country, should be capped. Why? Because limited power capacity and no competing with the AI industry. AI data center. The growth should be very stable, if not negative, actually, in Sweden, Norway, Finland. It's kind of mixed. Russia should continue to grow, actually, because even though you have seasonal bans, you have a better framework there. And same with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan should grow, specifically with the implementation of the last initiatives that I've told, and UAE and Oman also, even if you have limited capacity there as well. I would say not limited capacity, but you still need to handle and manage successfully how to deploy gas drilling sites or just sites that can require a high level of capex. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I see the diversification the mining footprint, so it will continue to diversify, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much for the breakdown, Valentin. And if you want to read the report, which I highly recommend you do, you can find it on hashlabs.io on our insights page. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.